perhaps the most precarious moment in Donald Trump's presidency, he doubles down on obstruction. This time, it's the congressional investigations into his finances, his efforts to obstruct the Mueller probe, and the testimony of the official who ran the White House office in charge of security clearances that he's seeking to block. But the conduct is very familiar to anyone who's peeked at Volume 2 of the Mueller report on obstruction. The president today telling reporters he will fight the subpoena from Congress to question former White House counsel Don McGahn, who emerged as Robert Mueller's star witness.
We just went through the Mueller witch hunt where you had really 18 angry Democrats that hate President Trump. They hate him with a passion. They were contributors in many cases to Hillary Clinton. Hate him with a passion. How they picked this panel, I don't know. Now we're finished with it, and I thought after 2 years, we'd be finished with it. No, now the House goes and starts subpoenaing. We're fighting all the subpoenas. Look, these aren't like impartial people. The subpoena is ridiculous. I have been the most transparent president and administration in the history of our country by far.
Really? Here's what the most transparent president in history is fighting real hard to keep under wraps. His administration missed a second deadline to turn over his tax returns, something every other president has done since the Jimmy Carter administration. He's refusing to cooperate with an investigation into the White House Security Clearance Office that granted Jared Kushner clearance despite concerns raised by the CIA. He's suing Congress to avoid turning over his business records, and the big headline of the day, Trump resisting subpoenas for White House aides to testify before Congress. Donald Trump explained his reasoning, if you can call it that, to the Washington Post's Robert Costa, who quotes the president in a blockbuster piece of reporting he did. Quote, "There is no reason to go any further, and especially in Congress, where it's very partisan." Obviously, very partisan, Trump said. The New York Times adds this great reporting, quote, "President Trump's administration foreshadowed weeks, if not months, of trench warfare with Congress on Tuesday as it defied demands for documents and testimony on multiple fronts in an effort to thwart expanding investigations mounted by House Democrats. And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. At the table, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, NBC and MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilemann. Joining us from the New York Times, White House correspondent Annie Carney, and Robert Costa, Washington Post national political reporter. Robert, I want to talk about your interview with the president, your reporting about what the White House plans to do on these multiple fronts. But I have to start with something that I just found amazing. The president tweeting on his Twitter feed, "I didn't call Bob Costa, he called me. I don't think I've said that to anyone since I was 13. Take us through your night of reporting and interviewing the president.
It's a very simple, unexciting story. I asked. No, I'm serious.
I believe you.
So as any reporter would do, I was working on a big profile story, still am, about a person in the president's orbit. Reached out for the White House for comment for this profile story. The president decided to return my call and grant an interview on that topic. And during the course of that interview, after I finished my questions on that, asked him, as any reporter would, about the news of the day. And I made sure to note the context of this conversation on Twitter before I even published the interview. So from my end of things, I have done just what any reporter would do to provide all the information to our readers and to our source about how everything went down.
So take us inside what you're actually reporting. I mean, with Donald Trump, there's always the theatrical side of things, but the substance of your reporting is important for all of these multiple fronts that the White House is on the receiving end of subpoenas and requests for testimony on.
What the president revealed in the conversation and what his aides have been underscoring again and again in private conversation is that this White House wants to go to war against House Democrats and refuse any sort of request, whether it's about Don McGahn's testimony, the president's finances, the security clearance process at the White House, and they believe they can argue that he fully cooperated with the Mueller probe in their view. Of course, the president repeatedly attacked the Mueller investigation throughout the course of the probe and called it a partisan witch hunt again and again. But he believes because his officials testified to Mueller and talked to the grand jury, he doesn't need to do anything with Congress. Congress and House Democrats are saying you just can't stop replying to Congress. There's a constitutional right of Congress to have oversight over the executive branch. And this is something the White House is shrugging off, which will create an even more dramatic standoff in the weeks to come as the White House tries to fight the House Democrats building an obstruction case.
Annie Carney, you and your colleagues have some extraordinary reporting today about what this looks like on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. And I worked in a White House that was under investigation by Democrats for most of the time in which I worked there. And the idea, this sort of zero-sum analysis that the president has that simply call them obstructionists and it's a win, seems very short-sighted to anyone who spent more than 5 minutes in Washington. Just take us through the mechanics of some of the specific fights they're taking on. This is one White House group of senior advisors, one White House counsel's office that will be fielding document requests, email requests, aides testimony. Those aides will have defense lawyers. I mean, this is a very, very, very big burden to take on if you plan to fight it all.
It is. And just to the bigger point here that the president is not wanting to comply because he calls Congress a partisan organization. When is Congress? I mean, it is by nature a partisan organization. That's not news. That's how it works. This is how divided government works. And he's learning that the hard way. But there are, the Treasury Department is making clear they're stonewalling and slowing down any potential release of his tax returns. They are not, so they're stonewalling that. Any more information about the security clearances and how Jared Kushner was granted one, they're stonewalling that. Not letting aides testify. The problem here, though, with the McGahn situation in particular, is this question of executive privilege. McGahn has already sat for hours and hours in front of the special counsel. And the question here is kind of how do you put the toothpaste back in the tube? How do you now exert something you already waived and let him testify already in that setting and say now he can't testify in a different setting? That's the legal question that they're going to have to be arguing with, and we'll see where that lands. And if they can actually prevent these witnesses from testifying before Congress.
And Annie, it's
but in terms of...
Oh, go ahead. No, keep going.
I was just going to say, in terms of fighting with lawsuits, Donald Trump has been filing lawsuits, is kind of defined his entire career as a businessman for 40 years. I think USA Today did an amazing piece during the election that showed he's been involved in more than 4,000 lawsuits, either suing people or being sued since the beginning of his career. This is how he uses it as a tool to slow stuff down, as a tool of intimidation. Whether he wins or loses, he gets to do a press conference and look like he's fighting back. And it's a tool in his tool bag that he's going to use now.
And he's trotting out an even bigger one, talking today about taking one of these cases to the Supreme Court. I wanted to play at the beginning of the show the PBS How a Bill Becomes a Law, because there seems to be some confusion about the branches of government. But I want to follow up with you, Annie, on this question of Don McGahn. His lawyer, Bill Burke, putting out a statement that makes abundantly clear that for his part, McGahn is agnostic. He's not enthusiastic to go testify before Congress. He's not reluctant. He's simply been subpoenaed and is interested in responding to that, however the process takes him. It seems that they have in him someone who, everything being relative, is an honest broker.
That seems like the way they're positioning him. And it's not clear to me what Don McGahn personally would prefer to do here. But they are, the statement from his lawyer makes it clear that he wants to follow the law and do as he's supposed to do without a game, like a stake in the game.
And that, John, seems to be the conundrum they're going to face. When people are subpoenaed and they have hired defense attorneys on their own dime, they're not necessarily going to fall into line and walk lockstep behind a president that wants to sue people before the Supreme. The things he says are nonsensical. It's not like all of these people who are out in the private sector paying for their own defense counsels are going to follow him down the rabbit hole.
Sure, and some of these people have obviously didn't follow him down previous rabbit holes. In the case of Don McGahn, by not following him down various rabbit holes, he probably did Donald Trump a big favor in terms of some of the obstruction of justice that McGahn saved him from. There's a lot to say here about the political strategy that the White House is pursuing, and whether by provoking Congress, by pushing Nancy Pelosi into a corner to defend the institutional prerogative of Congress, she's going to end up with no place to go but impeachment, which is clearly something she was reluctant to pursue as recently as 4 or 5 days ago. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. But I think when it comes to there's an element of high human drama here when it comes to Don McGahn, because he is not under the control of the White House any longer. Right. He's going to face a point where he's going to make a decision. This could be tied up in the courts for some period of time. Joyce is going to talk to us in a second, I'm sure, about whether there's any kind of real plausible claim you can make to assert executive privilege over something that's already been testified to, or whether that has already been waived a long time ago. But McGahn presumably is going to have to kind of make a call at this point. His lawyer has said he doesn't want to be cited with contempt of Congress. Mm-hmm. He's clearly going to face a citation for contempt of Congress. So he's going to have to decide at some point, does he want to ride with the White House and try to hope that the courts will eventually side with them when that's unlikely, but it's going to take a long time to get a ruling? Or does he want to basically say, you know what, I'm going to play this down the middle, and where most good lawyers would tell him, which is, of course you don't have executive privilege anymore. Of course you're going to get slapped with a contempt citation. The right thing to do, according to black letter law, is you go testify, and we'll see what Don McGahn says.
And listen, if the president were able to sort of arrive at any comfort around the fact that McGahn, as Annie's colleagues have reported, will be a nuanced witness. It was his testimony that both painted the most devastating and damning portrait of Donald Trump's conduct, but it was also him refusing to carry out some of those requests to fire Mueller or get Sessions to unrecuse or fire Sessions that may have spared the president from a recommendation to charge. Donald Trump doesn't see any of that, or if he does, he's incapable of overriding that knowledge with downright terror at the optics. It's almost like the Cato Kalin, if this were the OJ trial of politics. And I think for Donald Trump, the idea of someone like Don McGahn describing what he told Robert Mueller, the president asked me to do crazy bleep, getting in his car, driving to the White House, packing up his stuff. I mean, the theatrics of that, if Donald Trump understands anything, he seems to understand how politically damaging that would be.
I think that might be right. And, to back up just one step before we start, this is why the White House counsel represents the presidency and not the president, to ensure that the institution is preserved, because what this president does in many ways sets precedent for future White Houses. And this area of executive privilege, there really isn't a lot of clear law. There's very little case law. Mm-hmm. Typically, as you know, there's an accommodation process between Congress and the White House, where Congress says, we really need this testimony, and the White House says, we're not crazy about giving you everything, and they try to work it out. So that won't be the process here. And with McGahn, it's interesting. It's a lot like when Sally Yates testified, and it became clear that she could and would testify despite objections from the White House. There are a couple of benchmarks for whether or not there's a privilege. One is that the privilege cannot be used to hide illegal conduct or misconduct. So if that's what McGahn's going to testify about, then there's no privilege. But also there's the waiver issue, which looms very large here. Even if the White House could argue that talking to Mueller's team didn't amount to a waiver of privilege because it was still a conversation inside of the executive branch, once the report is publicly released, I think privilege is fairly waived. It's tough to maintain that one with a straight face at this point.
Barbara Costa, I want to ask you not about the politics of impeachment, because it's clear that the White House has arrived at a conclusion that benefits them, at least at some level. That would explain their blanket position on all of these requests, subpoenas and interviews and whatnot. But on Donald Trump, who's so acutely aware of his brand, his weapon, his cudgel against Hillary Clinton was that she functioned as though she were above the law, that she was hiding things on her emails. Is there any glimmer of doubt or any sign of life in terms of a conscience in that White House that the picture of Donald Trump in the Mueller report is of someone who very much sees himself as lawless and terrified of transparency, of the bright light of congressional scrutiny, and of revealing things he very much wants to keep secret? secret: his finances, his taxes, and his businesses.
There have always been presidents in American history. You look at someone like Jimmy Carter, who comes in with the so-called Georgia Mafia, who feel like total outsiders in Washington. And I've only been a reporter for the past 10 years, so I don't want to speak to the entire history of the country. But when you talk to White House officials and people close to President Trump, they say they feel like total outsiders still 2+ years into this administration, and they loathe congressional Democrats. There is no willingness to engage, even when you bring up constitutional questions about oversight of the executive branch. They believe they are in the trenches. They were in the trenches from day one. They will be in the trenches until at least January 2021. And at this point, they also feel like the system is set up through the Constitution and the way power works in this country to protect them. Because even if the House Democrats do move on impeachment, Senate Republicans controlling the majority there, in the view of the White House, will never pursue a trial that would actually remove the president from office. So when they see that is the scenario, they say, why cooperate? And the president, with his Roy Cohn mentality instilled into him over decades, he's stoking that feeling inside of the White House. Don't testify. Don't share documents. If we're going to have anything pulled out of our hands, it's going to be by a federal court and not by a lawmaker.
Andy, let me play you the president in his own words about keeping all these things hidden from the voters.
Now the House goes and starts subpoenaing. They want to know every deal I've ever done. Now Mueller, I assume, for $35 million, checked my taxes, checked my financials, which are great, by the way. You know they're great. All you have to do is go look at the records. They're all over the place. But they checked my financials and they checked my taxes, I assume.
They're great. They're great. They're all over the place. Mueller saw him. Ask him. Your thoughts?
I mean, this is back to Trump keeps flipping back and forth on his reaction to Mueller. Is he the victim or the victor? Was Mueller a great American hero who did his job and now we're done? Or was he the leader of a band of 13 angry Democrats who were also a partisan organization? He goes back and forth, and I think in reality what he's responding to every time is the coverage, not the report itself. He claimed total exoneration, and he seemed to be in a happy place until he saw over the weekend how the report was being covered, and then his aides have over the weekend had to talk him down and say, you know, it's not that bad, but he's enraged by how it's being covered. But he keeps flipping back and forth, victor or victim. That's the question.
Howman, do you think Mueller saw his taxes? And I agree with Annie Carney's assessment, and I think her paper reported over the weekend that he has not read the report. It's not that long. It's a mystery to me why he hasn't cracked it yet.
Well, it shouldn't be a mystery. He doesn't read anything.
Correct.
I mean, we've had tons of reporting on this.
Say his
he's
friends.
not. So say his friends. I mean, the reporting on this seems pretty clear over time that he's not a reader. And we know that how the briefings take place. The PDB, it has to be, you know, coloring books and pictures and, you know, pop-up things and, you know, special, you know, visual aids for him. So it doesn't surprise me that he hasn't read. It's a long report. You know, 444 pages. That could be his whole lifetime of read material. But he does watch the coverage.
Correct.
And so do I think, I mean, esteemed legal minds and people who've worked at DOJ, FBI, and other places have said throughout this that they assume that Mueller has seen the taxes and that he started the investigation by looking at the taxes. Everybody I've ever asked, including Joyce, has said that they're pretty confident that's the case. But again, to Annie's point, I don't know what point he's trying to make. The weird thing that's embedded in that comment is the notion that he checked my financials, like as if it like he was getting his car tuned up or something. You know, like is the carburetor working? Is the oil full? You know, as if like the point of the tax returns is not that he cheated on his taxes. There's something wrong with the taxes, although there might be, but that the taxes are revelatory about what his sources of income are, and that the sources of income could indicate various kinds of compromises and corruption and deals that are on this. You know, that we would know things about what's motivating him on the policy front if we knew where he was getting money. But the notion that like Mueller gave a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the taxes like he's H&R Block, you know, is not really the point of the whole thing.
Joyce, Politico's reporting today that Team Trump's bellicose tweets and public statements in the last few days are potentially exposing Trump to fresh charges of witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and impeding a congressional investigation now, not to mention giving lawmakers more fodder for their presidential probes. That's according to Democrats and legal experts. And there's been reporting about how questions question was on the table about whether they, and I know you tweeted about this today, whether they sought to obstruct the investigations out of SDNY by having the president's politically appointed U.S. attorney unrecused, that thing that we now know from the very lengthy Mueller report he was desperate to have Sessions do. Do you think there's some real exposure on this question for him?
Yes and no. The no part is easy. We know about the OLC memo that says that you can't charge a sitting president, and Mueller made it pretty clear that he took that seriously. But on the other end of this spectrum, and I think somebody needs to rush the comic book or the graphic novel version of the Mueller report to print quickly, because that's really only the first part. The second part is these 14 pending investigations. For instance, the Mueller report doesn't mention Matt Whitaker, the former Attorney General, acting Attorney General. We know from public reporting that there were conversations between Whitaker and the president about curtailing investigation in the Southern District of New York. I think we can expect to see the Southern District protect its prerogatives very vigorously. So there could be more to drop there. And it's interesting how the president tries to make this point, well, Congress isn't entitled to do any additional investigation of me. Mueller's already done everything. And that's really not true. Mueller limited his remit to Russia-related conspiracy and obstruction related to the Russia conspiracy. There is a whole universe out there that Congress is actually obligated to engage in oversight on. So it may not be SDNY who looks at obstruction. Ultimately, that might be Congress.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.